What I want to do in this short video is consider the issues around art and isolation through historical examples. There's nothing systematic about my selection of these examples, nor do I want to claim that they direct us towards a certain specific practice of art under conditions of isolation. Rather, I want to take what many people in the art world at the moment are thinking of as a negative situation and try to find numerous ways in which we can start to think of isolation as a kind of critical wake-up call. Certainly, works from art history are taking on new meanings today. I'm struck, for instance, by the documentation of the cleaning event performance by High Red Center in Japan in 1964, with the artist wearing face masks that have become so familiar to us while meticulously cleaning the streets. And the maintenance works of Merle, Lederman and Kelly's from the late 1960s today reads, I think, as a monument to the safety of key workers who risk their lives through the care for others. In one sense, artists have always isolated themselves. When handicraft and industry were necessarily cooperative activities, artists worked alone in studios, or at least imagined themselves alone, even when their studios were occupied by family, friends, assistants, other artists and so on. But when we think of art, we think of the exhibition. The exhibition is a public and social event. However, the exhibition of an artwork is usually a string of short episodes in the history of that work. Most of the time, for most artworks, life consists of being stored and out of view, isolated. And yet, even when stored or hung on a private wall somewhere, the artwork continues to be significant for individuals who remember it or see it in reproduction, and works continue to circulate within art criticism, art history and art theory despite being out of circulation themselves. For an artist like Mona Hatoum, site specificity was always an alternative to the conventional relationship between the studio and the gallery. That is to say, for site specificity, the works are not produced in one place and transferred to another to be seen. Hatoum explains her process as follows. The location is usually the starting point. I like to visit the proposed site a year or 6 months beforehand. I go with an open mind, keeping myself attentive to whatever resonates with me or attracts my attention on that initial visit, and work out what is possible or suitable for that particular location. The concepts and choice of materials come through the confrontation with the place and people. It's often accidental or coincidental. A chance encounter or a conversation can inspire the work that I end up making for that specific location. While site specificity has typically been characterised by the artist taking trips to specific places in order to make interventions that respond to place, the constraints imposed by lockdown might give rise to a different kind of practice, one that is a practice of site specificity that is more local or domestic. One precedent of this kind of work is that of Fran Cottle. Since 2001, Cottle has used her own house as the site for her work. She alters this domestic environment through architectural interventions. For instance, she built a walkway running through the centre of her home with mesh walls dividing the public corridor and private living space. Another example is the work of Barbara Stavini, who in the last years of her life conducted a series of documentary walks on the sites of projects which she'd participated in during the 1960s and 1970s. Tim Brennan is a performance artist who's been using the guided walk as a technique for producing critical interventions in sites since the 1990s. While walking any distance from your home with others is not possible during lockdown, the technique of the walk, reflecting on history, still is. Duchamp's miniature reproductions of his life's work, which he made to carry around in a suitcase, has been understood as an art of exile. But from today's point of view, we can see this as an art also of isolation, inasmuch as it relocates his work in the home and on a domestic scale. Nancy Holt's land art, which is on a much bigger scale, is a form of sculpture that runs away from the gallery and the art crowd. To see the work face to face, so to speak, requires the viewer to make a long journey, for the viewer to isolate themselves too, and the work itself returns to arts institutions and arts community only in the form of photographs, maps and other documents. Walter de Maria's Earth Room from 1977 in New York filled a gallery with earth and therefore does not allow viewers to enter the gallery. Other artists have also closed galleries to the public in various ways and for various reasons, but what they all have in common is the physical impossibility of a crowd entering the gallery or of individual viewers standing side by side. Mail art bypassed the gallery and the dealer system by passing directly from the artist's studio, often their own home, to the recipient, typically also in their own home, who was conceived of as neither a public nor a collector, but some new kind of addressee for art. Mail art functioned like a subculture. Mail art historian John Hell Jr. puts it this way: the most important part of mail art has not been in the products which have been created, but the structure of interaction which was involved. In this sense, mail art reverts to one of the original formats of the bourgeois public sphere in the 18th century, the community of the letter. Art and Language, the international art group, have talked about making their early works in the kitchen through conversations between themselves. This is work on the scale of the household. They also, at one point, sent recordings of lectures for an exhibition in New York. Here the artist's response to a public display of their work is to stay at home and send a mediated technological proxy for the artist. Consider next the following sketch. This is for a breathing piece by the performance artist Alan Caprow in 1979. This is a quote: "Alone, studying your face in a chilled mirror, smiling, scowling perhaps, a microphone nearby amplifying the sound of your breathing, a swivelling electric fan directing the air around the room, gradually leaning closer to your reflection until the glass fogs over, moving back until the image clears, repeating for some time, listening." Vito Acconci, we could say, also self-isolated in the 1970s, making works at home or building a private space within the gallery for the artist to occupy, away from the viewer, or making videos of the artist talking to an absent viewer. Robert Smithson took photos of what he called monuments of his hometown while on a walk by himself in 1967. Smithson also made a work in 1969 by turning over a rock. This is presented in the form of two photographs in the classic combination of a before and an after shot, but the action or performance takes place on a walk alone and consists of a simple intervention in the landscape. Also, artists have put their works in art magazines, bought advertising space in newspapers, submitted artworks to personal columns, fly-posted cheap copies on the streets, handed out artworks the size of business cards, given away zines and tape cassettes. Artworks have been buried instead of exhibited. For instance, Sol LeWitt photographed a cube being buried in Holland in 1968. When Christo and Jean-Claude lacked the resources and clientele to realise their grand public projects of wrapping buildings and monuments, they simply drew images of what they had in mind. Lockdown gives these techniques and strategies a new relevance. They become resources for thinking about art, not only to respond to the temporary circumstances of lockdown, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to think about what kind of culture we want afterwards.